Picture this moment. Really picture it. The year is 1868, and the desert air shimmers with heat that makes everything look like a mirage. Dust swirls in small cyclones across the parade ground of a frontier military post, and then time stops. Apache women warriors, their faces still streaked with the sacred white paint of battle, stand in chains. The paint, that's important. This isn't ceremonial decoration we're talking about here. This is war paint, applied in the darkness before dawn raids, blessed by medicine women, believed to turn bullets aside like raindrops. These women have just come from fighting for their lives, for their children's lives, for their very way of existence. And staring back at them, buffalo soldiers, black men in blue uniforms, rifles in hand, tasked with guarding the most dangerous prisoners the United States Army has ever taken. Now think about this for a second. Think about what both sides are seeing. The Apache women look into faces that are not white. These aren't the pale-skinned settlers who've been stealing their land, murdering their families, breaking every treaty ever signed. These are black faces, scarred faces, faces that know suffering. And the Apache women, they recognize something. Something that makes the moment electric with tension you could cut with a knife. Among these prisoners stands Lozan. If you don't know that name, you should. Lozan, sister of the great war chief Victorio, a woman who could sense enemies approaching from miles away, who rode with the fiercest Apache warriors and held her own against anyone foolish enough to challenge her. She's standing there in government-issued shackles, staring at Sergeant Emmanuel Stance. Stance, remember that name too, because we'll be hearing it again. This is a man whose own mother bore whip scars across her back, whose childhood was spent in the cotton fields of the South, until emancipation gave him a choice between poverty as a freedman or a soldier's pay on the frontier. He chose the uniform. He chose the frontier, and now he's choosing to look directly into the eyes of a woman who, until yesterday, was trying to kill every American soldier she could find. The mutual recognition is instant and terrifying. Here's what makes this moment so extraordinary and so heartbreaking. The United States government didn't assign these buffalo soldiers to guard Apache prisoners by accident. Oh no, this was calculated. This was policy. Think about the sick genius of it. Take the people you've oppressed for centuries, give them guns and uniforms, then order them to cage the people you're oppressing right now. Use America's most oppressed to guard America's most defiant. Standing among the Apache women is Dateste. And if you think these names are hard to pronounce, imagine being a young soldier from Louisiana trying to learn them. Dateste, who rode with Geronimo himself, who spoke Apache, Spanish, and English fluently, who could track a man across 50 miles of desert and put an arrow through his heart at 100 yards. She's watching these buffalo soldiers with eyes that miss nothing, cataloging their weapons, noting their discipline, seeing their pain. Because here's the thing that gets me about this moment. Both sides understand exactly what's happening. The Apache women know they're facing men who understand chains. The buffalo soldiers know they're guarding women who understand what it means to have everything stolen from you. Private John Randall stands at attention, barely 19 years old, his hands trembling slightly as he grips his Springfield rifle. He's fresh from the Louisiana cotton fields, where his mother still works as a sharecropper, slavery by another name. And he's staring at Guyon, a woman whose husband was murdered by Comanches, who tracked down his killers and personally killed them with her own hands. She's maybe 5 feet tall, and she's looking at this teenager like she's calculating exactly how many seconds it would take to snap his neck, which she probably could. The silence stretches like a bowstring. Desert wind kicks up another dust devil. Somewhere in the distance, a bugle calls evening formation. And in that moment, in that perfect crystalline moment of recognition, between oppressed and oppressed, between warrior and warrior, the real war begins. Not the war you read about in history books, not the war of cavalry charges and official reports. The war of human hearts forced into impossible situations by a government that understood, with cold precision, exactly what it was doing when it put these two groups together. You see, the Apache wars weren't just about land. They weren't just about manifest destiny or westward expansion, or any of those sanitized phrases we use to make ethnic cleansing sound like policy. The Apache Wars were about one simple, terrifying question. What happens when an unstoppable force meets an immovable object? The Apache women were the immovable object. For centuries, they had defended their homeland against Spanish conquistadors, Mexican armies, and now American expansion. They had developed a warrior culture so effective, so absolutely ruthless in its efficiency, that grown men would abandon entire settlements at the mere rumor that Apache women warriors were in the area. These weren't just fighters. These were tacticians who could disappear into landscape that looked empty to everyone else. These were strategists who could feed their families and conduct guerrilla warfare simultaneously. These were women who could give birth in a hidden canyon and be back on the war trail within days, babies strapped to their backs as they planned the next raid. And the Buffalo Soldiers? They were the unstoppable force. Black men who had survived slavery, survived the Civil War, survived Reconstruction, and now found themselves on the frontier with something they'd never had before: weapons, training, and orders to use both. They were proving themselves to a nation that didn't want them, serving a government that barely acknowledged them as human, protecting settlers who often hated them more than they hated the Indians. So what happens when you force these two groups together? When you take women who have spent their entire lives fighting for freedom and put them under guard by men who have spent their entire lives fighting for dignity? Something unprecedented, something the government planners in Washington never anticipated. Something that would reshape the American West in ways that historians are still trying to understand. Lozan shifts her weight, and her chains clink in the desert silence. Sergeant Stantz adjusts his grip on his rifle. Private Randall swallows hard and tries not to meet Guyen's calculating stare. Dateste continues her assessment of these strange new captors, these warriors who wear the uniform of her enemies but carry the scars of her people. And in that moment, that perfect, crystalline, heartbreaking moment, the stage is set for one of the most complex, most human, most ultimately tragic stories in American history. Because here's what's coming. Here's what none of them know as they stand there in the desert heat, measuring each other, recognizing each other, preparing for what comes next. They're about to discover that sometimes, when you force two oppressed peoples to face each other across a divide of chains and uniforms and orders, something beautiful and terrible happens. They start to see each other as human beings. And that changes everything. The sun begins to set behind the mountains, painting the desert the color of dried blood. And Private Randall realizes he's going to have to learn how to sleep, knowing that Guyen is watching him through the bars of her cell. Planning, always planning. Sergeant Stantz looks at Lozan and sees his own mother's defiance in the set of her shoulders, the lift of her chin. And he knows, with the certainty that comes from shared suffering, that this woman will never be broken. Not by chains, not by imprisonment, not by anything the United States government can devise. The war paint on the Apache women's faces begins to streak with sweat and dust, but it doesn't fade. It won't fade for days. And every morning, when these Buffalo Soldiers look at their prisoners, they'll be reminded that they're not guarding defeated enemies. They're guarding warriors who simply haven't died yet. And that's where our story really begins. 3 years pass. 3 years of uneasy standoffs, broken promises, and small skirmishes that newspaper editors back east barely mention. But April 30th, 1871, changes everything. Camp Grant, Arizona Territory. Dawn is still 2 hours away when the killing begins. Picture the scene, and I warn you, this gets dark fast. 144 Apache women and children sleeping in their traditional wickiups just outside the military post, under what they believed was government protection. They'd come in for peace talks. They'd brought their families, because that's what you do when you trust someone enough to negotiate. They trusted wrong. The attack comes from 3 directions simultaneously. American settlers from Tucson, Mexican vaqueros seeking revenge for old raids, and Papago Indians settling scores that go back generations. But here's the thing that makes your blood run cold. The United States Army knows it's coming. Officers at Camp Grant have been told to look the other way, to be somewhere else, to let justice, as these vigilantes call it, take its course. So when the shooting starts, when the screaming begins, when clubs start crushing skulls in the pre-dawn darkness, the Buffalo soldiers are confined to quarters, locked in their barracks, forced to listen to massacre and do nothing. Think about that for a moment. Really think about it. These are men who survived slavery, who fought in the Civil War, who've spent 3 years on the frontier proving their courage over and over again. And they're being ordered to sit still while women and children are butchered 50 yards from their windows. Private Randall, remember him. That 19-year-old from Louisiana. He's pressing his face against the barracks window, watching muzzle flashes in the darkness, hearing sounds that will haunt his dreams for the rest of his life. And he can't do anything. Orders are orders, but some sounds carry further than gunshots. When it's over, when the sun rises on Camp Grant, the silence is worse than the screaming was. 144 dead, mostly women, mostly children, bodies scattered around cooking fires that were still warm from the night before. Corn mush spilled in the dirt, mixed with blood. And that's when Sego Juni sees her sister die. She's 23 years old. A wife and mother who's never held a weapon more dangerous than a skinning knife. She's been gathering wild onions since before sunrise, trying to supplement the meager government rations when she hears the shooting. She runs toward camp, toward her family, and arrives just in time to watch a Tucson merchant named William Oury put a pistol to her sister's head. Her sister is holding a baby. Her sister is begging in broken English. Her sister dies anyway, the baby crushed beneath her falling body. Sego Juni watches this happen from behind a mesquite bush 30 feet away. She watches the merchant kick her sister's body to make sure she's dead. She watches him reload his pistol and look around for more targets, and something breaks inside her. Something that will never heal, but here's where the story gets complicated, where it becomes something more than just another frontier massacre. Because when the Buffalo soldiers are finally released from their barracks, when they're ordered to clean up the scene, to bury the bodies, to restore order, they recognize what they're looking at. This isn't their first massacre. These soldiers have seen burned churches in Memphis, bodies floating in the Mississippi after New Orleans riots, children shot down in the streets during Reconstruction violence. They know what organized racial terror looks like. They know the smell of it, the particular silence that follows it, the way survivors' eyes look when they've seen the unthinkable. Captain Louis Carpenter, and this is a name you need to remember, son of escaped slaves from Maryland, wounded twice in the Civil War, now commanding Buffalo soldiers in Arizona Territory. He's walking through the aftermath at Camp Grant, cataloging the dead, trying to maintain military composure. And then he sees her, a little Apache girl, maybe 6 years old, clutching a corn husk doll, shot through the chest. Still holding that doll like it could protect her from bullets, Captain Carpenter kneels down beside her, and the years just wash away. He's 8 years old again, hiding in a root cellar in Maryland while slave catchers search the farm above. His sister Sarah is beside him, clutching her own corn husk doll, whispering prayers that the men with guns won't find them. Sarah, who died of fever 2 weeks later. Sarah, who never let go of that doll, even at the end. Now here's where it gets really interesting. Because this massacre, this Camp Grant massacre that was supposed to terrorize the Apache into submission, has the exact opposite effect. Instead of breaking Apache resistance, it transforms it. Apache women, who had been primarily responsible for keeping families fed and protected while men conducted raids, suddenly become combatants. Not just supporters of the war effort, actual fighters, warriors in their own right, and their transformation follows ancient protocols. The ceremony of becoming a warrior requires 4 days of preparation, 4 days of fasting, of prayers, of ritual purification. On the 4th day, the women paint their faces with sacred white clay, mixed with ground turquoise, paint that's believed to turn bullets aside, to make the wearer invisible to enemies, to channel the power of warrior spirits who died defending their people. Juni undergoes this ceremony in a hidden canyon 20 miles from Camp Grant. 3 other women join her, women who lost husbands, sisters, children in the massacre. When they emerge on the 4th day, they're no longer wives and mothers who happen to be Apache. They're Apache warriors who happen to be women, and that changes everything about how this war gets fought. See, Apache men fight like Apache men. Direct confrontation when the odds are good, strategic retreat when they're not. Honor in battle, respect for worthy enemies. It's warfare, but it follows rules, patterns, traditions that go back centuries. Apache women warriors, they fight like mothers whose children have been murdered. There are no rules, no codes of honor, no mercy for anyone who threatens their surviving family members. The war escalates immediately. Buffalo soldiers on patrol start reporting something new, something that chills them to the bone. War cries in the distance that aren't the deep-throated battle shouts of Apache men. These are higher-pitched, ululating screams that seem to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Tones that make experienced soldiers check their weapons twice and pray to whatever gods they think might be listening. Sergeant Emmanuel Stance. Remember him from that first encounter. He's leading a patrol near the Dragoon Mountains when they hear it for the first time. That sound, that impossible sound, like all the fury in the world channeled through a human throat. His horse shies. His men look around with wide eyes. And Stance, who's faced Confederate cavalry charges, who's fought Comanche raiders, who's never backed down from anything in his life. Stance tells his men to retreat because he recognizes something in that sound. Something that reminds him of his mother's voice when the overseer came for his sister. Something that tells him these are no longer enemy combatants. These are mothers seeking vengeance. And there's nothing in this world more dangerous than that. The first engagement happens 2 weeks after the ceremony. A supply wagon heading from Tucson to Fort Bowie, guarded by 6 Buffalo soldiers and a civilian teamster. Standard run, routine protection. Nothing they haven't done 100 times before. The attack comes at noon, in broad daylight, from women who should be invisible but aren't quite invisible enough. Arrows start flying from rocky outcropping 200 yards away. Good shooting, but not great. The soldiers take cover behind the wagon, return fire with their Spencer repeating rifles, follow standard procedure. Then the war cries start, and the arrows become perfect. Every shot a kill shot. Every arrow finding the gap between helmet and collar, between belt and vest, the exact spots where a man is vulnerable. The teamster goes down first, an arrow through his throat that pins him to the wagon wheel. Private Morrison, a former slave from Virginia, takes one through the eye while trying to reload. The others cluster together, backs to the wagon, firing at muzzle flashes and shadows. That's when they see her, Juni, face painted with the sacred white clay, standing on a boulder 50 feet away like she owns the whole desert. She's holding a rifle, a Winchester repeater that she obviously doesn't know how to use properly. But she doesn't need to. She's not there to shoot them. She's there to look them in the eyes while the other women kill them. Sergeant Thomas Shaw, who's been in the army for 8 years, who's survived everything the frontier can throw at him, stares at this painted woman and realizes he's looking at death itself. Not death as an enemy to be fought, but death as a natural force, like lightning or flood. Something you can't negotiate with, can't reason with, can't defeat through superior firepower. The last thing Sergeant Shaw sees before the arrow takes him is Juni's eyes. Not angry eyes, not hateful eyes, just empty, like she's already dead inside and is simply waiting for her body to catch up. Only one Buffalo soldier survives that engagement. Private Williams, who plays dead under Shaw's body for 3 hours until the women decide they've made their point and disappear back into the desert. When rescue finally arrives, Williams is found babbling about painted ghosts, about arrows that change direction in mid-flight, about war cries that could freeze a man's blood in his veins. The official report classifies it as a standard Apache raid. Hostile contact, 6 casualties, enemy casualties unknown. File it and forget it, but Williams keeps talking. In the barracks, in the mess hall, to anyone who'll listen. He talks about how these weren't the same Apaches they'd been fighting for 3 years, how something had changed, how the women looked at them with eyes that had seen too much death to fear anymore. And slowly, word spreads through the Buffalo Soldier regiments stationed across Arizona territory. These aren't just Indians anymore. These aren't just enemies to be fought and defeated and sent to reservations. These are broken people who've decided to break back. Captain Carpenter arrives at massacre sites because there are more massacre sites now, many more, and finds himself writing reports that sound like descriptions of his own nightmares. Apache war parties that seem to materialize out of empty desert. Attacks that follow no tactical pattern anyone has ever studied. Fighting that seems designed less to achieve military objectives and more to make a point about pain. At one site near Tombstone, he finds evidence that chills him more than the bodies do. Arrows arranged in specific patterns around the dead. Symbols carved into wagon wheels. Messages written in Apache and Spanish that roughly translate to "Remember Camp Grant." These aren't raids anymore. These are reminders. Lessons being taught with bullets and blades, and the kind of methodical cruelty that comes from hearts that have been systematically emptied of everything except the need for revenge. And the Buffalo Soldiers. Men who thought they understood warfare. Men who thought they understood hatred. Find themselves facing something they've never encountered before. Enemies who have nothing left to lose and no intention of surviving the war they're fighting. Sergeant Stance, that same man who stared into Lozen's eyes 3 years ago and recognized a kindred spirit, now finds himself tracking women warriors who leave signs specifically for him to find. Messages scratched into rocks that say, in careful English, "We know you, Buffalo Soldier. We know your mother's scars. Come find us." It's an invitation and a challenge and a promise of mutual destruction, because here's what's happening. Here's the terrible truth that's slowly dawning on everyone involved. The Apache women have figured out exactly who they're fighting. They know these Buffalo Soldiers aren't just another regiment of white cavalry. They know these are men who understand oppression, who carry their own scars, who serve a government that barely acknowledges their humanity, and they're using that knowledge like a weapon. The psychological warfare becomes as important as the physical warfare. Apache women start leaving trophies at battle sites, not scalps. That's not their tradition. They leave personal items, letters from home, photographs, Bible verses, things that force the Buffalo Soldiers to remember that their enemies know exactly who they are, where they come from, what they've survived to get here. Private Randall finds his own mother's recipe for cornbread tucked under a rock near his patrol route, written in his mother's handwriting. Impossible, but there it is. A recipe that somehow traveled from a Louisiana sharecropper's cabin to the Arizona desert, carried by women who have never been within 1,000 miles of Louisiana. The psychological impact is devastating. These Buffalo Soldiers, who've spent their entire military careers proving they're as tough, as brave, as capable as any white regiment, suddenly find themselves questioning everything. Their orders, their enemies, their own role in a war that's starting to feel less like military duty and more like a cosmic punishment for sins they didn't commit. And all the while, more Apache women are undergoing the 4-day ceremony. More warriors are being born from the ashes of Camp Grant. More mothers are painting their faces with sacred clay and picking up weapons they've never held before. Sergeant Stance wins his Medal of Honor during this period, the highest military decoration the United States can bestow. He earns it by leading a rescue mission that saves 37 white settlers from an Apache attack near Fort Davis. Under heavy fire, he organizes a fighting retreat that covers 12 miles of open desert, keeping women and children alive against impossible odds. The irony burns like acid in his throat. He's being decorated for saving the same type of people who massacred Apache. Women and children at Camp Grant, the same type of people who'll probably murder him if they ever catch him alone and unarmed in one of their towns. He's saving people who hate him to protect them from people who understand him, and somewhere in the desert, Apache women warriors are watching through telescopes they've taken from dead soldiers, learning his name, studying his tactics, adding him to their list of targets who deserve special attention, because they know, with the clarity that comes from absolute loss, that Sergeant Stance is the most dangerous kind of enemy, a good man following bad orders in service of an evil system, and those are the men who require the most careful killing. The war is escalating beyond anyone's ability to control it, beyond anyone's ability to understand it. Apache women who were wives and mothers 6 months ago are now leading war parties that leave no survivors. Buffalo soldiers who joined the army for steady pay and a chance at dignity are now hunting down women whose children they can't stop thinking about. And somewhere in Washington, officials are starting to realize they may have created something worse than an Apache war. They may have created an Apache revolution, led by women who have nothing left to lose and every reason to take as many enemies with them as possible when they die. The desert runs red with blood, and nobody knows how to make it stop. 15 years. 15 years of war, of raids, of massacres on both sides. 15 years of Apache women warriors learning to kill with the efficiency of surgeons and the coldness of winter. 15 years of buffalo soldiers hunting ghosts through desert canyons, losing their minds one arrow at a time. But all wars end. Even this one, September 5th, 1886. Geronimo surrenders. Not just Geronimo, the last free Apache war party. 38 people, mostly women and children, walking into the American lines under a white flag that's stained with their own sweat and tears. The war is over. The Apache have lost. And now comes the part that's always worse than the fighting. Now comes the reckoning. Picture the scene at Fort Bowie, Arizona Territory. 498 Apache prisoners, men, women, children, old people, babies, standing in the parade ground under a September sun that's hot enough to kill. They're chained. Not just the warriors, not just the men, everyone. Children as young as 6 years old wearing government-issued shackles that weigh more than they do. The irony would be funny if it wasn't so horrific. These are the same people who've spent 15 years proving they could disappear into landscape that looked empty to everyone else. These are the fighters who could travel 50 miles through desert without leaving a track, who could live for weeks on prickly pear fruit and morning dew. Now they're standing in chains, waiting for trains that will take them so far from home they'll never see their sacred mountains again. But here's what makes this moment extraordinary. Here's what changes everything about how this story ends. The Guards aren't white cavalry. They're not Texas Rangers or territorial militiamen or any of the usual suspects. The Guards are Buffalo soldiers of the 24th Infantry Regiment. Black men in blue uniforms, standing watch over the final defeat of the Apache Nation. And many of these soldiers recognize their own trail of tears. Private William Brown, 22 years old, son of escaped slaves from Georgia, looks at this scene and sees his grandmother's stories coming to life. The forced march from Virginia plantations to Texas cotton fields after emancipation, when freedom meant walking 1,000 miles in chains to new forms of bondage. His grandmother walking with a baby on her back and chains on her ankles, watching children die beside the road and not being allowed to stop and bury them. Now he's watching Apache children wearing the same chains, preparing for the same journey, and the parallel is so exact it makes him physically sick. The forced march begins on September 8th. 498 Apache prisoners, guarded by 2 companies of buffalo soldiers, walking from Arizona Territory to Florida. 1,300 miles, through New Mexico, Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama. 4 months of walking in chains through 100-degree heat, through autumn rains that turn the road to mud, through territories where every white face they see wants them dead. It's a death march. Everyone knows it. The government knows it. The officers know it. The soldiers know it. The Apache know it. The only question is how many will die along the way, and whether anyone will remember their names when it's over. But something happens on this march. Something unprecedented, something that changes both groups forever. It starts with water. Third day out from Fort Bowie, the temperature hits 108 degrees by noon. The Apache prisoners are given 1 cup of water every 4 hours. Barely enough to survive, definitely not enough to stay healthy. Standard procedure for transporting enemy combatants. Let thirst and exhaustion do what bullets couldn't. That's when Nana collapses. Nana, and if you don't know this name, you should. 60 years old. A medicine woman who's been fighting Americans since before most of these buffalo soldiers were born. She's walked 3,000 miles in her lifetime, following the seasons, following the game, following the ancient paths her people have traveled for centuries. But this March, these chains, this August heat, it's too much. She goes down near the Pecos River, convulsing with heat stroke, and the column stops. Standard procedure says leave her. Enemy combatants who can't keep up are expendable. There are railroad schedules to meet, quotas to fill, political pressure from Washington to get these prisoners to Florida before congressional sessions resume, and bleeding hearts start asking uncomfortable questions. Private Brown looks at Nana lying in the dust, 60 years old and dying of thirst while chained to a woman half her age. He looks at his sergeant waiting for orders. He looks at the other prisoners, watching their medicine woman die and knowing they're next, and he makes a decision that could get him court-martialed. He picks her up, 60-year-old, Apache medicine woman on the back of a 22-year-old buffalo soldier, walking through the New Mexico desert while his sergeant pretends not to see and his fellow soldiers pretend it's not happening. Brown carries Nana for 3 miles until she can walk again, whispering to her in the only language they share, the language of people who've watched their elders die from white men's cruelty. My grandmama walked this same road in chains, he tells her, though she probably can't understand the words. My grandmama made it. You gonna make it too. Nana survives. Word spreads through the column, not through official channels, but through the underground communication network that exists in every oppressed community. The Apache prisoners start looking at their guards differently, not as enemies exactly, but as something else, something more complicated. The train stations are worse than the walking. At each stop, El Paso, San Antonio, Houston, New Orleans, crowds gather to gawk at the famous Apache prisoners. White families bring their children to see the savage Indians in chains, to point and stare and ask loudly why the government doesn't just shoot them all and save everyone the trouble. The buffalo soldiers stand between the prisoners and the crowds, following orders but also following instincts that go deeper than military training. These soldiers know what it feels like to be exhibited like animals. They know what it's like to have white children point and stare and ask their parents why God made some people so dark. Corporal Isaiah Mays, remember this name, finds himself standing guard while a Apache mother tries to nurse her baby on a crowded train platform in Louisiana. White passengers are complaining about the smell, about the noise, about having to share space with savages. The mother is crying not from shame, but from exhaustion and fear and the knowledge that her milk is drying up from stress and malnutrition. Mays remembers his own mother's stories about nursing him on slave ships, about white passengers complaining about the noise while black babies died of starvation in the hold. He accidentally finds extra water for the nursing mothers. He forgets to search medicine bundles as thoroughly as regulations require. He starts humming spirituals while he walks his guard posts, and some of the Apache women recognize the melodies even if they don't understand the words, because here's what's happening. Here's the thing that the government planners never anticipated when they assigned buffalo soldiers to guard Apache prisoners. Shared suffering creates unexpected bonds. Fort Marion, Florida. November 15, 1886. The end of the trail. 498 Apache prisoners become 418 Apache prisoners. 80 people died on the march, mostly children, mostly elders, mostly people whose only crime was being born into the wrong century. Their names are entered into military records as transport casualties, as if they were broken. Equipment rather than human beings. The surviving prisoners see the Atlantic Ocean for the first time in their lives. Many of them weep, not from joy, but from the absolute certainty that they will never see their mountains again. The ocean is beautiful and terrible and infinite, and it represents everything they've lost. Every mile between them and home, every sacred place they'll never visit again, every ancestor they'll never be able to properly honor because the burial grounds are too far away to reach. Fort Marion isn't a prison in the traditional sense. It's a historic Spanish fortress, converted into what the government euphemistically calls an Indian school. The idea is rehabilitation, civilization, teaching savage peoples to become productive members of American society. The reality is cultural genocide with better public relations. Apache children are separated from their families on the first day. Parents who've walked 1,300 miles in chains, who've buried their own babies along the roadside, who've survived heat and hunger and the contempt of an entire nation, now have to watch their surviving children disappear into government boarding schools. The screaming lasts for hours. Buffalo soldiers are ordered to physically separate families, to drag children away from mothers who've already lost everything else. And these soldiers, these men who've spent 4 months learning to see their prisoners as human beings, find themselves in an impossible position: follow orders and destroy families, refuse orders and face court-martial. Some choose court-martial. Private Brown, the same man who carried Nana through the desert, refuses to drag a 6-year-old Apache boy away from his grandmother. The boy's parents died on the march. His grandmother is the only family he has left. And Brown looks at this crying child and this sobbing old woman and says, no, just no. He's court-martialed 2 weeks later. 50 days in the stockade, reduction in rank, forfeiture of pay. The charges read failure to obey lawful orders and conduct prejudicial to good order and discipline, but other soldiers follow his example. Corporal Mays accidentally allows families to say goodbye for hours instead of minutes. Sergeant David Adams develops sudden hearing problems whenever officers order him to use force against prisoners. Private Charles Williams starts getting sick every time family separation details are assigned. The underground resistance spreads. Buffalo soldiers start finding ways to smuggle letters between parents and children. They forget to search thoroughly, allowing prisoners to keep traditional medicine bundles and sacred objects. They look the other way when Apache women gather for sunrise prayers, when prisoners speak their own language instead of English, when children are taught traditional songs in whispered voices after lights out. These are small mercies, tiny acts of rebellion, nothing that changes the big picture, nothing that threatens the overall system of cultural destruction and forced assimilation. But to the Apache prisoners, these small mercies are everything, because here's what survival looks like when you've lost everything else. It looks like a buffalo soldier who pretends not to see you teaching your daughter the old stories. It looks like a guard who accidentally leaves water where you can reach it during the hottest part of the day. It looks like recognition in the eyes of another oppressed person who understands that sometimes the only choice is between small mercies and no mercy at all. The friendships that develop are dangerous for everyone involved. Fraternization with prisoners is a court-martial offense, but loneliness and shared suffering have a way of breaking down official barriers. Corporal Mays starts learning basic Apache words from the medicine women. Not enough to have real conversations, but enough to ask about their health, to understand when they're in pain, to offer what comfort he can within the constraints of his orders. The women teach him which desert plants can cure infection, which roots can bring down fever, which ceremonies can help a man find peace when he's far from home. In return, he teaches them English phrases that might help them navigate the American legal system. How to say, I need a doctor, or my child is sick, or this is not right, in ways that white authorities might actually listen to. These aren't romantic relationships, though some of those develop too, despite regulations and despite the racial barriers that make such connections incredibly dangerous for everyone involved. These are survival relationships, mutual aid societies formed in the shadows of an institution designed to destroy human connection. The children suffer the most. Apache children as young as 6 years old, shipped off to boarding schools in Pennsylvania and Kansas, where speaking their native language earns them beatings, where practicing traditional ceremonies earns them solitary confinement, where everything they've ever known is systematically stripped away and replaced with industrial training and Christian doctrine. But some Buffalo Soldiers find ways to help even here. Sergeant Thomas Shaw, the same man who survived that early engagement with Tukujuni's war party, uses his leave time to visit Apache children at boarding schools. Officially, he's checking on their welfare as part of military oversight. Unofficially, he's carrying messages from parents, smuggling traditional foods, reminding these children that they have not been forgotten. He finds 12-year-old boys who've been beaten for crying when they miss their mothers. He finds 8-year-old girls who've been locked in closets for braiding their hair in traditional patterns. He finds children who've been at the schools for 3 years and still wake up screaming in Apache, begging for their families. Shaw starts documenting these abuses in reports that somehow never reach his superior officers. He starts losing paperwork that would transfer particularly vulnerable children to even more distant schools. He starts developing mysterious administrative delays that keep Apache families in Florida longer than scheduled, allowing parents more time to figure out where their children have been sent. These are career-ending risks. Shaw knows it. His fellow Buffalo Soldiers know it. The Apache prisoners know it too. But sometimes, when you're part of a system designed to destroy human dignity, the only way to maintain your own humanity is to sabotage the system from within. The psychological toll on everyone is devastating. Buffalo Soldiers who joined the army to escape poverty and prove their patriotism find themselves administering policies that remind them of slavery. Apache prisoners who survived 15 years of warfare find themselves defeated not by superior tactics or overwhelming force, but by bureaucratic procedures designed to erase them from existence. Depression spreads through both groups like a plague. Suicide rates skyrocket. Men who survived combat with honor find themselves unable to survive peace with dignity. But something else spreads too. Something unexpected and powerful and ultimately transformative. Respect. Apache women start including Buffalo Soldiers in their prayers. Not as enemies, not as friends exactly, but as fellow travelers on a road nobody should have to walk. Buffalo Soldiers start learning Apache names for their prisoners, start seeing them as individuals rather than anonymous enemies. When Nana finally dies in 1889, 3 years after her collapse in the New Mexico desert, Private Brown is one of her pallbearers. An Apache medicine woman and a Buffalo Soldier walking together one last time, surrounded by people who understand that sometimes the only victory possible is dying with dignity intact. The funeral is officially a military procedure. Unmarked grave, minimal ceremony, efficient disposal of enemy remains. Unofficially, it becomes something else entirely. A gathering of people who've learned to see each other's humanity despite a system designed to prevent exactly that recognition. Apache prayers mixed with Christian hymns, mixed with African-American spirituals, all spoken in whispers because regulations prohibit such gatherings, but human hearts require them anyway. And in that moment, around that unmarked grave in the Florida sand, something new is born. Not friendship exactly, the power dynamics are too unequal for that. Not forgiveness, too much blood has been spilled on both sides, but understanding, recognition, the knowledge that oppressed peoples can find ways to honor each other's suffering, even when they're forced to participate in each other's destruction. The war may be over, but the real story, the story of what happens when humanity persists despite systems designed to destroy it, that story is just beginning, because some of these Buffalo Soldiers will carry Apache healing knowledge with them to wars in Cuba and the Philippines. Some of these Apache prisoners will use survival skills learned from black guards to navigate the legal and political systems that govern reservation life, and some of their children the children born from the relationships that develop despite regulations, despite racial barriers, despite every official effort to keep these groups separate. Those children will carry both bloodlines, both histories, both ways of understanding what it means to survive in America. The seeds of something unprecedented are being planted in the Florida sand. Something that will grow in ways none of these people can imagine, creating families and communities and ways of being that honor both Apache wisdom and African American resilience. But first, there's more suffering to endure, more families to separate, more children to steal, more ways for a government to prove that it can destroy anything, even the connections between people who understand each other's pain. The worst is yet to come. But so is the best, and that's what makes this story both heartbreaking and hopeful, both an indictment of American cruelty and a testament to human resilience. Because even in hell, people find ways to be kind to each other. Even in systems designed to destroy love, love finds a way to survive. Fort Sill, Oklahoma Territory, 1889. If you want to understand how the human heart finds ways to survive institutional cruelty, if you want to see how people create humanity in places designed to destroy it, then you need to understand what happens inside these prison walls between Apache women and Buffalo soldiers over the next 5 years. Because this is where the story gets dangerous. This is where individual choices start threatening the entire system. This is where people who are supposed to be enemies start seeing each other as something much more complicated. Picture Fort Sill's layout. Stone buildings arranged in a perfect square around a parade ground that bakes in the Oklahoma sun. Apache prisoners housed in barracks that were designed for soldiers, not families. No privacy, no space for traditional ceremonies, no way to maintain the cultural practices that have kept these people alive for centuries. Buffalo soldiers living in nearly identical barracks 50 yards away. Close enough to hear everything, close enough to see everything, close enough to start caring about things they're supposed to ignore. It's a recipe for disaster or transformation. Sometimes those are the same thing. The dance begins with medicine. Iteda is a 70-year-old Apache medicine woman whose knowledge of desert healing is encyclopedic. She knows which plants stop bleeding, which roots cure fever, which ceremonies can heal not just the body, but the spirit. She's been watching Sergeant Thomas Shaw for 3 weeks, noting his yellowing skin, his shaking hands, his difficulty staying awake during guard duty, malaria. Shaw picked it up in Florida and brought it to Oklahoma, where it's slowly killing him one fever spike at a time. The army doctors have given him quinine when they have it, told him to rest when they don't, and basically written him off as another casualty of frontier service. Iteda knows better. One morning, Shaw finds willowbark tea sitting beside his guard post, still warm. No note, no explanation, just a cup of bitter liquid that tastes like medicine and hope. He drinks it because what does he have to lose? His fever breaks that afternoon for the first time in 2 months. The next morning, there's more tea. And the morning after that, a routine develops. Iteda prepares the medicine, leaves it where Shaw can find it, disappears before he arrives for duty. Shaw drinks the tea, feels his strength returning, begins to understand that he owes his life to an enemy prisoner who has every reason to let him die. The debt changes everything. Shaw starts accidentally leaving things where Iteda can find them. Extra blankets during cold snaps, soap when the prison rations run out, medicine bundles that somehow don't get confiscated during surprise inspections. Small things, unofficial things, things that could cost him his stripes if anyone notices. But who's going to notice? His fellow Buffalo soldiers are dealing with their own impossible situations, their own moral complications, their own growing recognition that these Apache prisoners are not the savage enemies they expected to guard. The romance between Private John Randall and Machi Na develops slowly, carefully, through sign language and shared silences and the kind of patient courtship that happens between people who have all the time in the world and absolutely no privacy. Remember Randall? 19 years old when we first met him, trembling as he guarded Guyenne in Arizona territory. He's 25 now, a veteran of 6 years on the frontier, no longer a boy pretending to be a soldier. And Marchina is 22, an Apache woman whose husband died at Camp Grant, whose children were taken to boarding schools in Pennsylvania, whose entire world ended when she was barely old enough to understand what worlds were for. They communicate through letters drawn in the dust. He teaches her English by scratching alphabet symbols in the dirt during his guard rounds. She shows him which plants can cure infection by pointing out desert flowers that grow in the cracks between prison buildings. Conversations conducted in whispers and gestures, and the kind of intense eye contact that says, everything words cannot. This is not allowed. Fraternization with prisoners is a court-martial offense. Interracial relationships are illegal under territorial law. Even friendship between guards and prisoners violates every regulation in the military handbook. But loneliness has its own laws. And sometimes those laws are stronger than anything written by governments. The relationship deepens through small gifts and shared risks. Randall brings Machina news about her children, names of the schools where they've been sent. Reports from Buffalo soldiers who visit boarding schools during leave, proof that her babies are still alive, even if they're 3 states away. In return, she teaches him survival skills that aren't in any army manual: how to find water in drought country, how to treat wounds with desert plants, how to move through hostile territory without being seen. But it's more than practical knowledge they're sharing. It's something deeper, more dangerous to the system that keeps them apart. They're sharing their humanity when their relationship is discovered. And of course it's discovered, because prison walls have eyes and ears, and nothing stays secret for long. Randall faces 50 days in the stockade and reduction to private. The charges are specific: conduct unbecoming a soldier, fraternization with enemy prisoners, violation of territorial laws regarding interracial contact. Randall refuses to testify against Machina, refuses to provide details about their relationship, refuses to implicate other soldiers who might have known about the romance and looked the other way. He takes his punishment in silence, serves his 50 days, loses his stripes, and emerges from the stockade with his dignity intact and his feelings unchanged. The message spreads through both the Buffalo soldier barracks and the Apache quarters. Some things are worth suffering for. Some connections are more important than regulations. Some kinds of love are stronger than the systems designed to prevent them. Captain George Curry makes the most dangerous decision of his military career in the spring of 1891. He's been watching his Apache prisoners for 2 years, noting the depression that settles over them like fog. The way children stop playing and adults stop talking, and everyone starts dying of diseases that shouldn't be fatal. Cultural death, he realizes. They're dying of cultural death, and no amount of medical treatment will cure that. So he allows the sunrise prayers. Every morning at dawn, Apache women gather in the prison courtyard for traditional ceremonies. Officially, these gatherings are prohibited, part of the systematic effort to destroy Apache religious practices and replace them with Christian worship. Unofficially, Captain Curry argues to his superiors that spiritual destruction breeds desperate rebellion, and that allowing controlled religious expression might prevent the kind of uprising that could embarrass everyone involved. It's bureaucratic justification for a humanitarian decision. It's also career suicide if anyone in Washington decides to investigate. The women respond by including prayers for their guards' safety. Not because they're required to, not because anyone asks them to, but because they recognize something in these Buffalo soldiers that transcends the official-enemy relationship. They see kindred spirits, fellow travelers on roads nobody should have to walk, people who understand suffering because they carry their own scars, their own losses, their own complicated relationships with a country that uses them while despising them. The spiritual exchange becomes mutual. Buffalo soldiers start attending Apache ceremonies, not as guards, but as participants, learning songs that honor ancestors, participating in rituals that heal wounded hearts, finding comfort in spiritual practices that address kinds of pain their own churches have never acknowledged. And late at night, when official duties are finished and regulations are temporarily forgotten, something unprecedented happens in the Fort Sill darkness. Secret gatherings where Apache healing songs mix with African American spirituals, where traditional Apache flute music accompanies gospel hymns, where people who are supposed to be enemies discover that their ancestors' suffering has created similar medicines for wounded souls. These midnight sessions are dangerous for everyone involved. Military discipline forbids such gatherings. Racial laws prohibit such mixing. Prison regulations specifically prohibit prisoners from gathering without supervision. But need creates its own permissions, and sometimes the human heart's requirement for connection is stronger than any law written by people who've never been forced to choose between following orders and maintaining their humanity. Sergeant Emmanuel Stantz, remember him. The man who first locked eyes with Lozan in Arizona Territory finds himself in an impossible position. He's been promoted to Sergeant Major, the highest non-commissioned rank available to Buffalo soldiers. He's responsible for maintaining discipline, enforcing regulations, ensuring that his men follow orders without question. He's also watching his men become human beings in ways the Army never intended. Private Williams, who barely survived that early engagement with Segojuni's war party, starts having nightmares again when Apache children cry for their mothers. Corporal Jackson, a veteran of 15 years frontier service, begins questioning orders that separate families. Sergeant Brown, who carried Nana through the New Mexico desert, starts writing letters to congressional representatives about conditions in Apache boarding schools. These men are becoming problems. Not military problems. They still follow orders, still perform their duties, still maintain the discipline that makes Buffalo Soldier regiments among the most effective in the Army. They're becoming moral problems. Men who see too clearly, who care too much, who remember too vividly that they're participating in something that feels uncomfortably familiar. Stantz faces a choice that will define the rest of his career, the rest of his life, the rest of his legacy. He can enforce regulations strictly, court-martial the men who show mercy to prisoners, maintain the system that keeps oppressed peoples fighting each other instead of recognizing their common enemies. Or he can look the other way, allow the underground humanity to flourish, protect his men's growing compassion, even when that compassion violates every official policy. He chooses mercy, but he also chooses survival. Stantz develops what he privately calls temporary deafness and selective blindness. He doesn't see Corporal Mays sharing medical supplies with Apache women. He doesn't hear Sergeant Brown teaching Apache children to read English. He doesn't notice when prisoners and guards gather for those midnight spiritual exchanges that heal wounds no Army doctor has names for. But he also doesn't document these incidents, doesn't create official records that could be used against his men later, doesn't provide evidence that congressional investigators or Army inspectors could use to destroy the careers of soldiers who are simply trying to maintain their humanity while following impossible orders. It's a dangerous game, the kind of administrative cover-up that could end in court-martial for everyone involved if anyone decides to investigate. But it's also the only way to protect both his men and his prisoners from a system that seems designed to destroy everyone it touches. The Underground Railroad of Mercy operates with military efficiency. Buffalo soldiers develop elaborate systems for losing paperwork that would transfer particularly vulnerable Apache prisoners to even more distant facilities. They create administrative delays that allow families extra time together before children are shipped to boarding schools. They accidentally provide extra rations during food shortages and extra medical care during disease outbreaks. These are small rebellions, tiny acts of subversion that don't threaten the overall system but create spaces for humanity within institutional cruelty. Buffalo soldiers learning to be soldiers in ways their officers never intended, not just following orders, but protecting people from the worst effects of those orders, and the Apache prisoners respond with their own forms of resistance and reciprocity. Medicine women like Iteda start treating buffalo soldier ailments without being asked. Scouts share intelligence about hostile Apache bands that might threaten army patrols. Interpreters provide translations that help resolve conflicts before they escalate to violence. It's not friendship exactly. The power dynamics are too unequal for that. It's not forgiveness. Too much pain has been inflicted on both sides. But it's recognition, mutual aid, the acknowledgement that people who understand suffering have obligations to each other that transcend official relationships. The psychological impact on both groups is profound. Buffalo soldiers who expected to guard savage enemies find themselves protecting complex human beings whose pain mirrors their own. Apache prisoners who expected brutal treatment from government soldiers discover that some of their guards are as trapped by the system as they are. Depression rates among both groups actually decrease during this period. Suicide attempts drop. Even physical health improves as stress decreases and hope, however fragile, begins to take root in the most unlikely places. But the system notices. The system always notices when people start caring about each other in ways that threaten institutional control. Army inspectors start asking questions about discipline at Fort Sill. Congressional representatives begin receiving reports about lax security and inappropriate prisoner relations. Newspaper editors start writing editorials about buffalo soldiers who are going native and forgetting their duty to civilization. The pressure increases. Orders become more specific, more detailed, more designed to prevent the exact kinds of human connection that have been developing between guards and prisoners. Surprise inspections increase. New regulations specifically prohibit any interaction between soldiers and prisoners beyond official duties. The crackdown is coming. Everyone can feel it. The question is whether these fragile bonds between enemies becoming allies can survive official scrutiny, or whether the system will succeed in forcing oppressed peoples back into their assigned roles as mutual destroyers. Because here's what's really happening at Fort Sill. Here's what makes this period so dangerous to the powers that created it, Apache. Women and buffalo soldiers are discovering that they have more in common with each other than either group has with the white authorities they're both supposed to serve. They're recognizing that their real enemies aren't each other. Their real enemies are the systems that profit from keeping oppressed peoples fighting each other instead of working together. That recognition is revolution. Quiet revolution, personal revolution, the kind of change that happens one human heart at a time. But revolution nonetheless. And revolutions, even quiet ones, always face counter-revolution. The question is whether love, in all its complicated, forbidden, dangerous forms, can survive the violent reaction that's coming, because it is coming. The system that created this situation will not allow it to continue unchanged. The powers that profit from division will not permit unity to flourish. Even in the remote corners of military prisons in Oklahoma Territory, the test is approaching. The test of whether humanity can survive institutional cruelty, whether individual choice can triumph over systemic oppression, whether people can continue to see each other as human beings when every official force is designed to prevent exactly that recognition. And in that test, both Apache women and buffalo soldiers will discover what they're really made of, what they really believe, what they're really willing to sacrifice to protect the connections they've built in the shadows of empire. The stakes couldn't be higher, and the outcome is far from certain. 1890, the year the government decides that Apache culture isn't dying fast enough. New regulations arrive at Fort Sill with the brutal efficiency of military bureaucracy. No Apache language, no traditional ceremonies, no braided hair, no medicine bundles, no stories told in native tongues. No songs sung in ancient melodies. No children's games that might preserve cultural memory, complete erasure. That's the goal. Not just military defeat, that was accomplished 4 years ago. Not just physical imprisonment, that's been ongoing since 1886. Total cultural extinction. The systematic destruction of everything that makes Apache people who they are. But here's what government planners never anticipated. When you try to destroy a people's culture completely, you force them to become incredibly creative about preserving it, and Apache women have been masters of creative survival for centuries. Beshate leads the resistance. 62 years old, a grandmother whose own children were stolen for boarding schools, whose husband died fighting Mexicans before the Americans ever arrived, whose entire world has been systematically dismantled by bureaucrats in Washington, who've never seen a desert, never faced starvation, never had to choose between cultural death and physical death. She chooses neither. The underground school operates in the latrines. Think about that for a moment. Think about what it means when the only place you can teach your grandchildren their real names, their actual history, their true identity, is in the filthiest, most degrading space the authorities have provided, but it works. Because nobody supervises the latrines. Because guards don't follow prisoners into spaces that smell like human waste and desperation. Because even the most dedicated cultural destroyers have limits to how much degradation they're willing to witness personally. So that's where Apache children learn who they really are. In whispered conversations between prison toilets. In lessons scratched into wooden walls with fingernails. In stories told so quietly they're barely audible over the sound of running water and human misery. Beshate teaches them their real names, not the American names forced upon them by boarding school administrators. She teaches them the stories their great-grandmothers told around cooking fires, the ceremonies their grandfathers performed to ensure successful hunts, the songs. But some things are more important than personal safety. Some children are worth risking everything to save. The ceremony takes place over 4 nights in different locations around the prison compound. Apache women gather in tool sheds, storage rooms, anywhere they can find privacy for the prayers and songs that might restore a broken child's connection to her own identity. Buffalo soldiers provide security in ways they never learned in military training. Sergeant Stance posts guards who develop sudden hearing problems during the relevant hours. Corporal Mays creates maintenance emergencies that require his attention in areas far from where ceremonies are taking place. Private Brown starts a series of evening card games that happen to be loud enough to mask the sound of traditional Apache singing. The soldiers don't participate. In Apache ceremonies, that would be cultural appropriation of the worst kind. But they create space for those ceremonies to happen. They use their authority to protect activities they don't fully understand, but recognize as essential to their prisoners' humanity. On the 4th night, something shifts in Darkaya's eyes. The ceremony works. Not completely. 3 years of systematic brainwashing can't be undone in 4 days. But enough. She starts responding to her Apache name again. She stops reporting cultural activities to prison authorities. She begins, slowly and carefully, to remember who she was before Carlyle tried to erase her. The success creates a precedent that spreads throughout the Apache prisoner community. Other children returning from boarding schools undergo similar healing ceremonies. Other families find ways to reclaim members who've been culturally destroyed by American education. And Buffalo soldiers learn something profound about the people they're guarding. These aren't defeated enemies slowly dying in captivity. These are survivors developing new forms of resistance, new ways to maintain their humanity despite systematic efforts to destroy it. The smallpox epidemic of 1893 tests everyone's courage and character. The disease arrives at Fort Sill with a supply wagon from Kansas, spreads through the overcrowded prisoner barracks with the speed of wildfire, and threatens to kill everyone, Apache prisoners. Buffalo soldiers, white officers, civilian contractors. Death doesn't recognize military ranks or racial categories when it comes calling. Army medical procedures prove inadequate. Military doctors, trained to treat gunshot wounds and battlefield injuries, have no experience with epidemic disease management. The official medical response consists of quarantine measures that ensure more people die faster and prayer sessions that provide comfort, but no actual healing. That's when Apache medicine women take control of the situation. Tedder, now 75 years old and still treating Sergeant Shaw's recurring malaria with willowbark tea, organizes a medical response that combines traditional Apache healing knowledge with practical frontier medicine. She directs other medicine women to gather specific plants that grow wild around Fort Sill, plants that can reduce fever, boost immune response, and treat the secondary infections that often prove more deadly than smallpox itself. But she doesn't limit her treatment to Apache prisoners. When Buffalo soldiers start dying, when white officers begin showing symptoms, when the epidemic threatens to kill everyone, regardless of their official status, Tedder makes a decision that defines the rest of her life. She treats everyone: Apache prisoners and Buffalo soldiers, cooperative guards and hostile officers, people who've shown kindness to Apache families, and people who've enforced the harshest regulations. Because that's what medicine women do. They heal whoever needs healing, regardless of politics or personal relationships or official policies that try to determine who deserves to live and who deserves to die. Lieutenant James Moss, a white officer who spent 3 years enforcing cultural destruction policies, who separated Apache families without hesitation, who show no mercy toward prisoners under his command, contracts smallpox in the epidemic's 3rd week. Army doctors give him 48 hours to live. Standard military procedure would be to isolate him in the hospital until he dies, then bury him with appropriate military honors. Tedder saves his life with traditional medicine that military doctors have never heard of, healing techniques that were developed over centuries of treating epidemic diseases that swept through nomadic communities. Moss recovers completely, and when he does something unprecedented. He publicly credits savage remedies with saving his life. He writes reports praising Apache medical knowledge. He recommends that the Army study traditional healing techniques for potential military applications. It's career suicide. White officers aren't supposed to admit that Indians know anything valuable, certainly not anything related to medical science. But Moss continues advocating for Apache medicine women, continues documenting their success rates, continues arguing that traditional knowledge deserves respect rather than destruction. Some Buffalo soldiers begin questioning their role during this period. Not their military duties, they continue following orders, maintaining discipline, performing the tasks required of frontier soldiers. But their moral role in a system that seems designed to destroy everything valuable these Apache prisoners possess. Sergeant George Berry writes to his minister in Ohio, "We who know chains now forge them for others. We who escaped slavery now guard people whose only crime is refusing to become slaves. I do not know how to reconcile my duty as a soldier with my obligations, as a man who understands what freedom means." The letter is intercepted by military censors, as all soldier correspondence is reviewed for security purposes. Berry faces disciplinary action for seditious communications and conduct prejudicial to good order and discipline. But other Buffalo soldiers start expressing similar doubts, similar questions about their role in policies that feel uncomfortably familiar to men whose parents lived in bondage. Not open rebellion, that would mean court-martial and imprisonment. But quiet resistance, strategic non-compliance, the kind of passive subversion that allows orders to be technically followed while their spirit is systematically undermined. The Apache women notice this moral evolution among their guards. They respond by including Buffalo soldiers more explicitly in their prayers, their ceremonies, their community life, not as enemies who happen to be temporarily useful, but as fellow travelers on difficult roads, as people caught between impossible choices who deserve compassion rather than hatred. Trust develops slowly, carefully, through shared risks and mutual aid. Apache medicine women teach buffalo soldiers which plants cure infection, which roots ease arthritis pain, which ceremonies can help traumatized minds find peace. Buffalo soldiers share information about military policies, upcoming inspections, changes in regulations that might affect prisoner welfare. The exchange becomes institutional, though it remains unofficial and entirely invisible to higher authorities. An underground economy of knowledge and care that operates parallel to the official prison system, providing services that military bureaucracy never intended to offer. But the most profound change is psychological. Both groups begin to see beyond their assigned roles as prisoners and guards, enemies and captors, savage Indians and loyal soldiers. They start recognizing each other as complex, human beings trapped in an institutional system that serves neither group's actual interests. Apache women understand that buffalo soldiers didn't create the policies they're required to enforce. Buffalo soldiers understand that Apache prisoners aren't fighting against them personally, but against a system of cultural destruction that both groups find morally repugnant. This recognition creates possibilities that government planners never anticipated. Not friendship exactly. The power dynamics remain too unequal for that. Not political alliance. That would be treasonous for everyone involved. But something more subtle and potentially more dangerous. Mutual respect between oppressed peoples who recognize their common humanity despite official efforts to keep them divided. The seeds of change are taking root in Oklahoma soil. Not revolution in any conventional sense, but transformation at the level of individual hearts and minds. Changes in consciousness that will echo through generations in ways no one can predict. Because when people who are supposed to be enemies start seeing each other as human beings, when oppressed groups begin recognizing their common interests, when systems of control start breaking down at the most personal level, that's when real change becomes possible. Not change imposed from above by government policy or military force, but change that grows from below, from the recognition that people who understand suffering have obligations to each other that transcend any official relationship. The question is whether this fragile transformation can survive the pressures that are building against it. Whether individual choices to show mercy, preserve culture, and recognize shared humanity can withstand the systematic efforts to maintain division and control, because those efforts are intensifying. The system that created this situation is beginning to notice that something unexpected is happening at Fort Sill, and systems don't like unexpected developments, especially when those developments threaten the fundamental assumptions on which institutional power depends. The reckoning is coming. The test of whether love, in all its complicated, dangerous, transformative forms, can survive the backlash that always follows when oppressed peoples start recognizing their common humanity. And in that test, both Apache women and buffalo soldiers will discover what they're really willing to sacrifice to protect the connections they've built in the shadows of institutional cruelty. January 1st, 1900. The new century arrives with all the optimism that round numbers inspire, all the hope that fresh calendars promise. And for the Apache prisoners at Fort Sill, it brings something they haven't experienced in 14 years, official freedom. But here's the thing about freedom granted by the same government that stole it in the first place. It comes with conditions, restrictions, requirements that make it feel less like liberation and more like a different kind of prison. The Apache prisoners are released to reservations in Oklahoma and New Mexico, returned to lands that are called their homelands, but look nothing like the places they remember. Bounded by fences, supervised by agents, governed by regulations that make their traditional way of life impossible, while demanding they be grateful for the opportunity to survive as supervised Americans. This isn't freedom. This is managed existence. Open-air imprisonment with better public relations, but it's all they're going to get. And after 14 years in actual prisons, even managed existence feels like a victory worth celebrating. The farewells between Apache women and buffalo soldiers are heartbreaking and complicated and completely unofficial. No military ceremony marks the end of these relationships. No official recognition acknowledges the bonds that have developed between former enemies. These connections simply end, dissolved by bureaucratic efficiency and military transfers, and the simple fact that their official reasons for being in each other's lives no longer exist. Lozan never sees her mountains again. The greatest Apache woman warrior of her generation dies of tuberculosis in an Alabama prison cell on June 17, 1889, 11 years before official freedom arrives for the survivors. She dies far from the sacred places that gave her strength, far from the desert landscapes that taught her how to sense enemies approaching from miles away, far from everything that made her who she was. But she doesn't die alone. In her final days, buffalo soldiers who've learned to respect her strength visit her cell. They bring water when she's fevered, extra blankets when she's cold, news from the outside world when she's lucid enough to understand it. Sergeant Emmanuel Stantz is among her last visitors, the same man who first stared into her eyes in Arizona territory, who recognized something in her that transcended their official enemy relationship, who spent 13 years learning that strength and dignity aren't limited by race or gender or official status. They don't speak the same language. They've never had a real conversation, but they understand each other in ways that go deeper than words. Lozan dies knowing that some of her enemies learned to see her as a human being worth respecting. Stantz leaves her cell knowing he's witnessed the death of someone whose courage surpassed his own, whose commitment to her people put his own military service to shame. 6 months later, Sergeant Stantz is found murdered on a Texas road. The official report lists it as a robbery gone wrong. Traveling alone, carrying his army pay, victim of random violence that could happen to anyone foolish enough to venture into hostile territory without adequate protection. But everyone who knew Stantz understands what really happened. He was killed by the same white settlers he'd spent 15 years protecting, murdered by people who hated him more for his skin color than they ever hated the Apache warriors he helped defeat. The irony burns like acid. A Medal of Honor winner, a man who risked his life repeatedly to save white families from Apache raids, shot down by the very people he'd devoted his career to protecting. Killed because in the end his race mattered more than his service, his loyalty, his sacrifices. His death sends a message that echoes through every buffalo soldier regiment. Your service doesn't matter. Your courage doesn't matter. Your loyalty doesn't matter. You're still black in America, and that's all that will ever matter to the people you're protecting. But Stantz's legacy lives in unexpected places. Tessago Juni emerges from prison transformed. No longer the grieving sister who watched her family die at Camp Grant. No longer the painted warrior who hunted buffalo soldiers through desert canyons. She's become something new, a political strategist who understands both Apache traditions and American legal systems, a negotiator who can navigate between worlds most people can't even imagine. She uses skills learned in captivity, intelligence gathering, cultural code switching, psychological analysis of enemies, to become one of the most effective Apache advocates of the early 20th century. She files land claims that recover thousands of acres of stolen territory. She exposes corruption in the Bureau of Indian Affairs that has diverted millions of dollars from reservation communities. She organizes legal challenges to allotment policies designed to steal even more Apache property. Her methods are purely American: lawyers, courts, legislation, public pressure campaigns. But her motivation remains purely Apache, protecting her people from further cultural and economic destruction. The Buffalo Soldier regiments scatter to new wars in Cuba and the Philippines, carrying with them knowledge they never expected to acquire on the American frontier. Apache healing techniques save lives in Cuban jungles, where military medicine proves inadequate for tropical diseases. Traditional knowledge about water purification wound treatment, and epidemic disease prevention becomes essential survival information. For soldiers fighting in climates their training never prepared them. For Corporal Mays treats yellow fever in Havana using willow bark preparations he learned from Iteda. Sergeant Brown prevents dysentery outbreaks in Philippine villages using sanitation methods developed by nomadic Apache communities. Private Williams survives malaria in Puerto Rico by following dietary recommendations from Apache medicine women who spent centuries treating similar fevers in desert environments. These soldiers don't advertise the source of their medical knowledge. Savage remedies aren't something you put in official reports if you want to advance your military career. But they use what they learned, they survive because of it, and they pass the knowledge on to other soldiers who face similar challenges. Apache wisdom, filtered through Buffalo Soldier experience, spreads through the American military in ways that no government policy could have accomplished. Traditional knowledge preserved in prison latrines and midnight ceremonies becomes practical medicine for empire. The marriages between former guards and former prisoners create families that embody America's most profound contradictions. Children who speak Apache and sing spirituals. Families who understand both the pain of slavery and the agony of cultural genocide. Communities that carry dual heritage from two of America's most oppressed peoples. These mixed families face hostility from all directions. White society rejects them for their race and their Indian ancestry. Some Apache communities question their loyalty because of their African American heritage. Some African American communities distrust their Indian connections, but they create their own spaces, their own traditions, their own ways of being American that honor both bloodlines. Children who learn to track game using Apache methods and navigate racism using African American survival strategies. Families who attend both church services and traditional ceremonies, who celebrate both Christmas and seasonal Apache festivals, who understand that multiple identities aren't contradictory but complementary. John Randall marries Machinar in 1902, 2 years after her official release from prison. Their wedding is unofficial, unrecognized by territorial law, performed by an Apache medicine woman in a ceremony that blends traditional elements from both cultures. Their children grow up speaking 3 languages: Apache, English, and what they privately call prison talk, the mixture of signs, gestures, and coded phrases their parents developed. During those years when any communication between them risked court-martial and solitary confinement, these children understand something their grandparents never could have imagined, that survival sometimes requires embracing contradictions, accepting multiple identities, learning to be several different kinds of American simultaneously. They're living proof that even systems designed to destroy human connection can't completely prevent love from finding ways to flourish. Even policies intended to keep oppressed peoples divided can't stop individuals from recognizing their shared humanity and building families. Based on that recognition, Dateste lives until 1955, 91 years old. A survivor who witnesses the transformation of the American West from Apache homeland to modern states, from frontier territories to urban centers. In her final decades, she becomes a teacher and storyteller, preserving Apache history while acknowledging the complicated relationships that developed during the prison years. She speaks at universities, gives interviews to historians, provides testimony for legal cases involving Apache land rights. But her most important work happens in her own community, teaching young Apache women about their warrior heritage while honoring the Buffalo Soldiers who showed mercy. During the darkest period of Apache history, they, too, were warriors far from home, she says in interviews, conducted during the 1940s. They understood suffering because they carried their own scars. Some of them learned to see us as human beings, and that made all the difference. Her words become part of Apache oral tradition, stories that preserve both the pain of imprisonment and the possibility of connection across racial and cultural barriers. stories that acknowledge historical trauma while celebrating the individual choices that created hope in hopeless situations. The institutional impact spreads in ways no government planner ever anticipated. Buffalo Soldier regiments become known throughout the military as units with unusually low desertion rates, exceptional discipline, and innovative approaches to frontier challenges. Their success is attributed to superior training, strong leadership, and the natural advantages of men who've survived oppression. But military historians who study the records more carefully notice something else. Buffalo Soldier units that served at Apache prison facilities show different patterns than those that didn't. Lower rates of alcoholism, fewer incidents of violent misconduct, more successful transitions to civilian life after military service. These soldiers learned something during their prison guard duties that other military units never acquire. How to maintain humanity while following inhumane orders. How to show mercy within systems designed to prevent mercy. How to recognize the common humanity in people they're supposed to treat as enemies. These skills prove valuable in every subsequent military assignment. Soldiers who learn to balance military discipline with human compassion become more effective leaders, better peacekeepers, more successful at the complex challenges of occupation and pacification that define American military involvement around the world. The Apache reservation system, meanwhile, develops differently in communities where former prisoners maintain relationships with former guards. These reservations show higher literacy rates, better health outcomes, more successful resistance to cultural destruction policies. Not because Buffalo Soldiers provide ongoing assistance, most never see their former prisoners again after 1900, but because the relationships that developed during imprisonment created networks of knowledge and connection that persist even after the official relationships. Apache families who learned to navigate American legal systems from Buffalo Soldier allies become leaders in their reservation communities. Apache women who acquired medical knowledge from African American folk healing traditions become important healers in their new homes. Apache children who learned English literacy in prison latrines become interpreters and advocates for their communities. The knowledge flows both ways. Buffalo Soldiers who learn traditional healing techniques become important resources in their own communities. African American families in urban centers benefit from Apache knowledge about nutrition, herbal medicine, and psychological healing techniques that help people survive cultural trauma. These exchanges create a hidden infrastructure of mutual aid that operates beneath the official segregation policies of early 20th century America. Networks of support that cross racial boundaries. Knowledge systems that blend African American and Apache traditions. Communities that practice integration decades before it becomes legally possible. The government never intended these connections to develop. The prison system was designed to break Apache resistance while proving Buffalo Soldier loyalty to white supremacist policies. Instead, it created relationships that strengthened both communities while developing new forms of resistance to cultural destruction. By 1910, government officials begin noticing patterns they don't understand. Apache communities that should be dying out culturally show unexpected resilience. Buffalo Soldier veterans display unusual knowledge about frontier survival, traditional medicine, and cross-cultural communication. The conclusion is unavoidable. The prison system designed to destroy Apache culture and test Buffalo Soldier loyalty instead created an exchange of knowledge and experience that benefited both groups while undermining the racial hierarchies. The system was supposed to maintain this recognition, leads to policy changes designed to prevent similar developments in future conflicts. Segregation policies become more strict. Cultural destruction programs become more systematic. Military assignments are designed to prevent the kinds of long-term relationships that developed between guards and prisoners at Fort Sill. But it's too late. The connections have been made. The knowledge has been shared. The recognition of common humanity has taken root in ways that can't be undone by policy changes or administrative procedures. The seeds planted in Oklahoma prison soil are growing into something the government never anticipated. Networks of resistance that cross racial boundaries, knowledge systems that preserve traditional wisdom while adapting to modern challenges, communities that understand survival as a collective project, requiring cooperation between peoples who are supposed to be enemies. These developments won't prevent future injustices. They won't stop the continued oppression of both Apache and African American communities. They won't eliminate the racial hierarchies that define American society, but they create something else, proof that even in the worst circumstances, people can choose to see each other's humanity. Even in systems designed to destroy connection, individuals can create relationships based on mutual respect and shared understanding. These choices matter, not because they change everything immediately, but because they preserve possibilities for future generations. Because they demonstrate that oppression isn't inevitable, that racial hatred isn't natural, that people can learn to recognize their common interests, even when every official force works to keep them divided. The legacy of the Apache Buffalo Soldier encounter isn't just historical, it's ongoing. A reminder that transformation happens one relationship at a time, one act of mercy at a time, one choice to see beyond official categories and recognize the complex humanity in people we're taught to fear or hate or ignore. And in a country still struggling with the legacy of racial oppression, still learning how to create justice from systems built on injustice, still she's applying century-old lessons about connection across difference in contemporary conflicts where such connections mean the difference between mission, success and catastrophic failure. The oral histories reveal hidden truths that official records never captured. Love letters between Apache prisoners and Buffalo Soldier guards, written in code languages developed during imprisonment, preserved by families who understood their historical importance, even when the relationships they documented remained legally impossible. Recipes that combine Apache traditional foods with African American soul food traditions, creating new cuisines that reflect mixed heritage families. Children's games that teach both Apache survival skills and Buffalo Soldier military disciplines. Preserving knowledge from both traditions in forms that could be passed down safely. Dr. James Stantz Goudet, descendant of Medal of Honor winner Emmanuel Stantz and Apache medicine woman Nana, spends his career as a physician documenting traditional healing knowledge that was preserved through the prison exchanges. His research proves that Apache medicine women's treatments for epidemic diseases were often more effective than contemporary military medical procedures. His published studies vindicate choices made by Buffalo soldiers who risked court-martial to allow traditional healing practices, Apache women who shared medical knowledge with guards who could have used that information against them, relationships that preserved life-saving wisdom through periods when such knowledge was officially prohibited. But more importantly, his work creates modern applications for ancient wisdom. Urban hospitals treating minority communities now use communication techniques developed by medicine women who learned to treat patients across language and cultural barriers. Military medical units deploy with herbal supplements based on traditional formulations that kept people alive in extreme frontier conditions. Knowledge preserved in prison whispers becomes modern medical practice. Wisdom developed under the threat of court-martial saves lives. In contemporary emergency rooms, the DNA revelations are stunning in scope. Modern genetic testing reveals that thousands of American families carry both Apache and African American ancestry, most of them unaware of their mixed heritage until scientific analysis reveals connections their family stories never mentioned. These discoveries create identity crises and identity celebrations simultaneously. People who understood themselves as exclusively African American learned they carry Apache lineage. Families who maintained Apache cultural identity discover Buffalo Soldier ancestors who were written out of family histories for reasons no one remembers, but the revelations also create opportunities for healing Apache communities that lost members to intermarriage and cultural assimilation. Discover descendants who want to reconnect with traditional heritage. African American families that preserved stories about ancestors who went west finally understand what happened to those relatives who disappeared into frontier military service and never returned a home. The Fort Sill descendant gatherings become increasingly large and complex as more families discover their connections to this history. What began as a small commemoration of specific relationships has grown into a major reunion for hundreds of families whose ancestors' lives intersected during those prison years. The warrior women's legacy lives most clearly in their great-granddaughter's continued fight for justice. Not the same fights. The specific challenges have changed dramatically, but the same understanding that survival requires resistance, that dignity demands struggle, that freedom isn't given but taken by people willing to risk everything for the possibility of something better. Apache women today lead movements for indigenous sovereignty, environmental justice, protection of sacred sites, resistance to pipeline construction on traditional lands. They use legal strategies, political organizing, media campaigns, international advocacy, tools their great-grandmothers never had access to, but would recognize as forms of warfare, conducted by other means, and they maintain connections with African American activists facing similar challenges, understanding that environmental racism affects both communities, that police violence targets both groups, that economic inequality impoverishes both peoples, while enriching the same corporate interests that profited from 19th century land theft and forced labor. These contemporary alliances don't erase historical differences or contemporary tensions. Apache and African American communities still face distinct challenges, still have different relationships with American institutions, still carry different historical traumas that shape their political priorities, but they share enough common ground to work together on specific issues, to support each other's struggles when possible, to recognize that their separate fights for justice are part of a larger struggle against systems that profit from keeping oppressed peoples divided. Buffalo Soldiers' complex heroism reminds modern military personnel that honor can exist even within dishonorable systems, that individual choices matter even when structural change seems impossible, that serving with integrity sometimes requires questioning orders, challenging policies, and finding ways to preserve humanity while following institutional demands. This lesson has particular relevance for contemporary veterans who served in Iraq and Afghanistan, where American military operations often required cooperation with local populations, while implementing policies that many soldiers privately questioned. Veterans who learned to see Iraqi or Afghan civilians as complex human beings rather than abstract enemies, who developed relationships that transcended official military-civilian boundaries, who found ways to show mercy within systems designed to prioritize control over compassion. These veterans understand the Buffalo Soldier experience in ways that civilians cannot. The moral complexity of serving a country that doesn't always live up to its ideals. The psychological toll of implementing policies you don't personally support. The possibility of finding ways to serve with honor, even when the larger mission seems morally compromised. Some of these veterans become advocates for immigrant rights, understanding that many of the people they protected overseas are now seeking refuge in America from conflicts that American policies helped create. Others work with Native American communities, recognizing parallels between overseas occupation and domestic colonization that official military training never acknowledged. They're applying lessons about connection across difference that they learned in foreign combat zones to domestic social challenges, understanding that the skills required for building relationships with supposed enemies overseas are the same skills needed for healing divisions at home. The modern DNA revelations create more than just personal discoveries. They create political possibilities. When thousands of American families discover they carry both Apache and African American ancestry, it becomes harder to maintain political narratives that depend on fixed racial categories. Easier to imagine solidarity between communities that official policies work to keep separated. These families embody the possibility of multiple identities that aren't contradictory, but complementary. They understand viscerally that identity isn't just individual choice but family inheritance, that survival often requires embracing complexity rather than choosing sides, that healing historical wounds requires acknowledging multiple truths simultaneously. Their existence challenges every political strategy that depends on dividing oppressed communities against each other. How do you encourage racial resentment between groups when thousands of families carry both heritages? How do you maintain that cooperation across difference is impossible when hundreds of thousands of people are living proof that such cooperation not only happened but created the families telling the story? The contemporary veterans wearing buffalo patches while serving in Apache units represent something unprecedented in American military history, the transformation of symbols of division into symbols of unity, the reclamation of historical enmity as contemporary solidarity. These aren't just individual fashion choices. These are collective statements about the possibility of healing historical wounds while maintaining distinct cultural identities, about honoring multiple heritages without betraying any of them, about creating new traditions that acknowledge complex histories rather than trying to simplify them. Military commanders initially view these developments with suspicion. Mixing historical symbols seems like a threat to unit cohesion, a distraction from military effectiveness, a dangerous precedent that might encourage other forms of cultural expression that could undermine official discipline, but the results prove otherwise. Units that embrace this complex heritage show higher morale, stronger internal bonds, better performance under stress. Soldiers who understand themselves as carrying forward multiple traditions of military honor prove more resilient, more adaptable, more effective in environments where cultural understanding determines mission success. The military learns, slowly and unofficially, that acknowledging historical complexity makes soldiers stronger rather than weaker, that honoring diverse heritages builds unit cohesion rather than threatening it, that creating space for multiple identities enhances rather than undermines military effectiveness. The final lesson is both simple and profound. Even in history's darkest chapters, human connection finds a way, not always, not easily, not without tremendous cost and suffering and loss, but persistently enough to preserve possibilities for future generations, consistently enough to prove that oppression isn't inevitable, frequently enough to demonstrate that individual choices can create cracks in institutional cruelty wide enough for change to take root. The Apache, women and buffalo soldiers who created these connections, didn't know they were making history. They thought they were simply trying to survive impossible circumstances with their humanity intact. They made individual choices to show mercy, preserve dignity, recognize shared suffering, create spaces for connection within systems designed to prevent exactly such connections. But their individual choices accumulated into something larger, proof that transformation is possible even under the worst circumstances, that love can survive even the most systematic efforts to destroy it, that people can learn to see each other's humanity even when every official force works to prevent such recognition. Their legacy lives in every choice to show compassion when compassion isn't required, every decision to preserve culture when culture is under attack, every recognition that people who understand suffering have obligations to each other that transcend official relationships. It lives in contemporary families who carry both heritages forward, in modern soldiers who honor multiple traditions of military service, in activists who build coalitions across racial boundaries, in communities that practice cooperation despite policies designed to encourage competition. It lives in the understanding that survival isn't just individual but collective, that freedom isn't just personal but communal, that healing isn't just historical but ongoing, and it continues today. In every moment when someone chooses to see beyond official categories and recognize the complex humanity in people they're supposed to treat as enemies. Standing in that Oklahoma field where prison walls once divided, Apache women from Buffalo Soldiers. Their descendants understand that they're not just commemorating the past, they're continuing it, making choices that will determine whether future generations inherit more division or more connection, more hatred or more understanding, more reasons for despair or more possibilities for hope. The story isn't finished. It never will be, because every generation faces the same choice their ancestors faced, whether to see each other as enemies or as fellow travelers on difficult roads, whether to perpetuate systems that profit from division or create relationships that make healing possible. The Apache women and Buffalo Soldiers chose connection over division, mercy over cruelty, hope over despair. They made those choices at tremendous personal cost, under impossible circumstances, when every rational analysis suggested that such choices were futile. They were wrong about futility. Their choices created families, preserved knowledge, demonstrated possibilities that continue to inspire change more than a century later. Their example doesn't guarantee that we'll make similar choices, but it proves that such choices are possible, that they matter, that they can create legacies more powerful than the systems that tried to prevent them. And sometimes that's enough. Sometimes the possibility is all we need to find the courage to choose connection over division, mercy over cruelty, hope over despair, just like they did. In prison courtyards and midnight gatherings, in shared medicines and whispered languages, in relationships that preserved humanity when humanity seemed impossible to maintain. Their story reminds us that even in the darkest times, love finds a way, even when everything seems hopeless. Hope survives, even when systems seem designed to destroy human connection. People find ways to connect, and that's the most important lesson of all, that the future isn't determined by the systems we inherit, but by the choices we make within those systems, the relationships we create despite official barriers, the mercy we show when mercy isn't required. The Apache women and Buffalo Soldiers proved it's possible. Their descendants continue proving it today. And that possibility, that persistent, stubborn, beautiful possibility, remains available to anyone willing to choose connection over division, understanding over hatred, love over fear. The only question is whether we'll have the courage to follow their example, whether we'll choose to see each other's humanity despite every force that encourages us to see only enemies, whether we'll create relationships that preserve possibilities for future generations, just as they created relationships that preserved possibilities for us. The choice is ours. The possibility is proven. The legacy is waiting to be continued. All we have to do is choose love over fear, just like they did. In the darkest of times, under the worst of circumstances, against all reasonable expectations, they chose love and changed everything.